Hello.
Get him on the tiny little thing. Get her to take the picture. I said,
Hey, Pastor.
oh, man.
All right, we can start now. The pastor's here.
Speaker wise, is it your computer?
I think so. I'm
Yeah,
hearing
go
people.
up here. Go up to mute.
Hang on a second. Let me admit.
Yeah,
But it's not gonna last very long, but it's gonna.
go up to mute.
Okay.
Right there, now.
She really-
Okay. Okay, select speaker. You can go to 42-inch right up there. Click on that.
And then the sound comes
Yes.
out there. Oh, nice.
Somebody say something.
Hello.
There it is.
Okay, he showed me a trick, so now everybody in the room can hear you better
So,
when you say something. So
I
be careful what you say.
thought Armageddon was coming. Where they were describing all the snow. And it didn't happen.
Well, we got more snow than I like to see on April 27th. Let's put it that way. Yep. Well, and it was that wet, heavy concrete like stuff, and I went out multiple times and scooped it. I knew my snow blower wouldn't do anything with it. It'll just clog it up. All right, let's get going with the Viking Age. Christianity under attack. Okay, so by way of review, the Viking Age kind of kicks off, so to speak, in the year 793, when the Vikings, kind of out of nowhere, sack the monastery on the English island of Lindisfarne. And Lindisfarne was famous enough that this sent shockwaves not just throughout Northumbria, not just throughout England, but all the way into Europe, right? At Charlemagne's court, they heard about this and were shocked. And that kind of set off the whole Viking Age, the whole period where the Vikings would raid Britain, Ireland, the continent, as we're going to see tonight at the end, even Eastern Europe, the Vikings are in. So after Lindisfarne is hit, we have this initial period which lasts several decades, where the Vikings mainly practice these hit and run tactics. But as we saw last week, in 866, they decide they're going to take it up a notch and not just rampage throughout Britain, but in fact, attempt to conquer Britain, conquer England. And this comes in the form of what the English call the Great Heathen Army, right? Because the Vikings at this point are pagans and the Anglo-Saxons have been Christians now for almost 300 years. And as we saw, the Great Heathen Army was initially led by the sons of that most famous Viking of the early Viking Age, Ragnar Lothbrok. And what we saw last week was that England, which really didn't exist as a political entity at that time, really what we had was 4 independent English or Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. We saw how the Great Heathen Army conquered 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the last kingdom standing was Wessex, okay? The southern part of Great Britain. And about the time that Wessex was starting to come under attack by the Great Heathen Army, we had a change in leadership in Wessex. We had a series of brothers who died one after another until we got to the youngest, this kid named Alfred. And we talked about Alfred as being number one, an unlikely successor to the throne because he had so many older brothers. And he was really not viewed as a welcome addition to the throne because of his personality. He was very bookish, right? He carried the handbook around with him that he would scribble notes in, which was really weird for people of his class and time. And he had this mysterious illness where he could be stricken with these fits at any time and basically curl up on the floor into a ball. So the Anglo-Saxons are down to their last man, third stringer, and they bring in Alfred. But Alfred, as we saw, rises to the challenge. And when the Viking army under the leader Guthrum attacks Wessex, Alfred defeats them and forces Guthrum to take refuge in Mercia. And that's where we left off last week. So before I get into this week's content with Wessex momentarily triumphant over the Vikings, any questions about what I covered last week or up to this point? Okay. So if the West Saxons think they have defeated the Vikings for good, they are wrong. Christmas of the year that Alfred has driven Guthrum out of Wessex, he and his men are at his court. They are celebrating, as Winston Churchill in his History of the English speculated, they're probably drunk, okay? And the time for making war is past, right? Nobody makes war in the winter when there are no crops in the field to feed yourself. But the Vikings launched this surprise attack, and they hit the English when they're least expecting it, when they're reveling over their victory and over the Christmas season. So they are totally unprepared for what happens. And the surprise is so complete that everybody at Alfred's court has to scatter. They have to flee in panic, including King Alfred himself. King Alfred goes on the lam, basically trying to keep one step ahead of the Vikings who are trying to hunt him down and conquer the kingdom by taking the king. So Alfred is out wandering through the West Saxon countryside with maybe a couple of bodyguards with him. And this is where we get to the low point of the kingdom. This is the point where it looks like England is totally going to succumb to the Vikings, and there's not going to be an England. There's just going to be a western province of Denmark, okay? So Alfred's out wandering around, trying to stay one step ahead of the Vikings, and he takes shelter with some little peasant woman, okay? And so he's got the cares of the world on his head. He's worried about his kingdom. He's worried about his family. He's worried about his own life. And she asks him to keep an eye on some loaves that she's baking, okay? And Alfred, of course, says, yeah, I'll do this. But he's so distracted that he doesn't notice the loaves burning, okay? And the woman comes back and chews him out. The King of England, you know, Alfred the Great, she chews him out for letting the loaves burn, right? And this is a great story about just how low Alfred had sunk, how low the kingdom had sunk. Alfred keeps going. He remembers there's a royal hunting lodge, if you will, in the marshes of Somerset. So kind of in this whole giant swampy area, there's a little island in the middle of this swamp that nobody really knows how to get to unless you've been there before. So Alfred knows how to get there, but he knows the Vikings won't know how to get there. So he makes his way to this lodge on this little island in the marshes. And that little island, for the time being, is all that exists of the West Saxon kingdom. The Vikings are running rampant throughout the kingdom. Some of the nobles in Wessex are making a separate peace with the Vikings. It looks like things are coming to an end. So Alfred, from his little redoubt there in the marshes of Somerset in the western part of Britain, sends out the word to his followers where he is. And gradually the guys that got scattered when the Vikings attacked and other followers of his start to make their way to join him on this island of Athelney in the Somerset marshes. And again, the Vikings are out raiding. They're visiting all the nearby farmhouses and so forth, both raiding and looking for Alfred. And from this little safe spot that he's got, he and his men start ambushing these Viking raiding parties and scoring little victories over the Vikings. And the word spreads. The king is still alive. He's putting up a fight. He puts heart back into the people of Wessex. Again, some of them go to join him in Athelney, but eventually it gets to the point where Alfred is strong enough and he knows the kingdom understands his situation well enough that he says, we're going to summon the entire army, the entire herd, as the Anglo-Saxons call it. We're all going to meet at this famous location called Egbert's Stone, and we'll meet there on this appointed day. So Alfred sets out to Egbert's Stone, and of course, he really doesn't know how many people have gotten the message and how many people are going to respond to the message, but he's putting his faith in God that God will deliver and that he'll have a large enough army that he can confront the Vikings. And indeed, when he gets to Egbert's Stone, he's amazed by the huge number of West Saxon warriors who have turned out, who've been inspired by what Alfred has been doing in the marshes of Somerset. So the Vikings learn about this gathering of the English army, and they march to confront the army. And they actually seize the high ground near to where Alfred and the herd have gathered at a town called Chippenham. And so they take the high ground. They know the English are going to have to attack them. So when the English attack, they're going to have to be attacking uphill. So the Vikings are taking the strategic advantage of the terrain. Nevertheless, Alfred leads the inspirited West Saxons against the Vikings and defeats them. And the Vikings then retreat into the town of Chippenham itself. When they had learned that Alfred was gathering the West Saxon army, they had sent word to a third son of Ragnar Lothbrok, a guy named Ubi. And Ubi is another famous warrior. In fact, he's got a mystical banner that he fights under, this raven banner that you see here. And according to lore, whenever that banner flutters, Ubi is victorious. But if for some reason the banner were to droop, all bets are off for Ubi. So the plan the Vikings have is, at the same time that the main army is going to confront Alfred in the eastern part of Wessex at Chippenham, Ubi is going to attack from Wales down in the western part. And it's going to be a pincer movement. They're going to sandwich the English between their two armies. Or perhaps Ubi will be able to come up from behind and surprise Alfred, okay? So Ubi sails down and traps the English forces that are there in the western part in a fortress called Kinwit, which is on the northern shore of that Cornish peninsula. So the Vikings are camped down below this fortress. The English, with a much smaller force, are inside, and the Vikings plan to starve them out and then move to attack Alfred. But as they are there, kind of minding their business, waiting for the English to surrender, the Raven banner droops. And that night, the leader of the English forces there, an ealdorman called Oda, leads a surprise attack out of his fortress against this much larger Viking army. He burns their ships and defeats the Viking army there. And when news of this reaches Chippenham, the Vikings there, who have been holding out, waiting for this relief force to come, now realize it ain't gonna come. And so they surrender to Alfred after a 2-week-long siege. Alfred at this point has them at his mercy, but again, Alfred is motivated by this idea that he wants to convert the Vikings to Christianity. If we can make them Christians, they're no longer our enemies, right? So he offers very generous terms to the Vikings and says, y'all have to be baptized as Christians, and we're going to start with you, Guthrum. And Guthrum really doesn't have any choice at this point. He says, okay. And at his baptism, Alfred acts as his godfather. Alfred is his personal sponsor in baptism. And then after the baptism, Alfred hosts this giant banquet, this giant feast, and entertains the Viking king and all these Viking warriors that he's been fighting against as a celebration of them coming to Christianity. They make a treaty, and they're going to divide England between them. Alfred gets all of Wessex, which he already controls, plus part of Mercia. Remember, Mercia, that middle kingdom, was the last to fall, and it was kind of a debated land between the Vikings and the West Saxons. So we're going to kind of divide Mercia in half, and it becomes part of Alfred's kingdom of Wessex. The rest of England is given to the Danes. And so what we get is this part of England that is called the Danelaw, an area that is under Danish law, okay? And then in the south, we've got Wessex, but for the first time, they start to use another term for Wessex, Angleland. No longer just the kingdom of the West Saxons, but indeed the kingdom of all the English. And this is really the birth of England. And Alfred starts to use the term King of the English rather than King of the West Saxons. So we can thank the Vikings for the fact that there is something called England. So now Alfred has bought himself some time, and this is where he really starts to demonstrate his genius as a ruler. We're going to talk about a number of Alfred's reforms that collectively, along with the heroic story we just heard about him retrieving the situation from the very precipice of disaster, right? On top of that, Alfred is going to remake the Kingdom of England and put it on a footing to conquer back all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from the Vikings. So the first thing he does is he sets up this scheme for the defense of Wessex, because he knows the Vikings are going to come at him again. Okay, he's no fool. And what he does is he comes up with this idea of a web of forts. And every one of these forts, they're called burhs. It's basically like a fortified village, if you will. Every one of these is going to be located so that all the people in Wessex and southern Mercia are always within 1 day's march of a burh. The burhs are basically 20 miles apart from each other. Okay? So everybody lives close enough that they can get to the safety of a burh by walking for 1 day. Some of the burhs straddle rivers. It's like two little burhs with a bridge over the river. And the idea here is, if the Vikings try and sail up that river, the defenders can go on the bridge, they can throw rocks down on the Vikings, they can throw their spears, they can shoot arrows at them, whatever. But it's a way of cutting off the access to the inland part of England through the rivers, which is the Vikings' chosen way to invade, right? He probably also set up a series of warning beacons, right? So if one burh sees a Viking army invading, they can light a big fire, and then the surrounding burhs know, we got to take shelter. We got to prepare for this. Alfred also makes reforms to the army itself, the fyrd, okay? So the fyrd, up to this point, has basically been a militia. It's all the free men in England, and in times of war, they have to drop whatever they're doing and provide military service. So it's for a fixed period of time each year, and they're not professional soldiers who are in the field all the time. It's basically like the National Guard, okay? Well, Alfred says that system has not worked for us. By the time a Viking army is inside of Wessex, we don't have time to summon the fyrd, right? Otherwise, the Vikings do all their damage and they leave by the time the fyrd is there. So he says, we're going to divide the fyrd into halves, and one half of the fyrd is always going to be in the field. So for half of the year, this group is in the field. The other half of the year, this other group. In other words, we're going to have a standing army for the first time in history. He requires the nobles to have horses. They have to supply themselves with horses so that the army has mobility. We can move faster, or at least as fast as the Vikings who are attacking us. Now, all this stuff costs money, very expensive reforms, and Alfred faces a lot of opposition from guys who don't want to pay more taxes, even though it's for their own good. Alfred also beefs up the Navy. In Victorian times, when Alfred was considered this Superman and could do no wrong, they kind of tagged him as the father of the English Navy, okay? Which is a little bit of an exaggeration, but he definitely did invest in a Navy and make some changes to the way the Anglo-Saxons fought on the sea. His strategy was, we're going to build huge ships, 60 oars, which is about twice the size of a typical Viking ship. And what we'll do is, when the Vikings sail up a river, we'll sail our huge ship into the estuary and basically bottle them up. And if we can get close enough to one of their ships, we'll lash the ships together. And the 60 guys on my ship will jump on the 30 guys on the Viking ship. And that's the naval battle of Alfred's design. So to finance all of this, he's got to figure out a system for taxation because he's doing stuff on a scale that no Anglo-Saxon king has ever done. He needs revenue unlike any Anglo-Saxon king has ever raised. So what he does is he comes up with this concept of the hide and the hundred. A hide is basically the amount of land that it takes for one family to subsist. And the brilliance of the hide is that in one part of England where it's really fertile, that might be just a few acres. But in other parts of England, out on the moors, where it's really scrubby land, it might take a couple dozen acres to support a family. So this concept of a hide isn't a fixed amount of land, it's whatever is required in that area to support one family. And of course, if you're a really rich guy and you have lots and lots of land, right, the amount of land you control could potentially support multiple families. So your estate might be worth 10 hides, for example. So this is the concept of the hide. And then he groups the hides together into what are called hundreds. So 100 hides becomes a political unit that is assessed for taxation. You're going to be responsible for supporting one armored cavalryman, okay? And we have a document called the Burgle Hidage, which talks about how he's staffing and financing these burghs, these fortresses that he's building. And basically what it comes down to is that every burgh has a pretty much standardized size, a standardized circumference of wall, and the local community is going to have to provide one fighting man for every 5.5 feet of wall. And so Alfred, in his administration, works it out for all these different areas in the kingdom, how many hides there are, how many hundreds there are, how many people we can gather for this particular burgh. It's really quite sophisticated for its time. So in addition to his military and financial reforms, Alfred also implements cultural reforms. We saw Charlemagne do the same thing in our class on the Pope's forgery. But you got to remember that what he's inheriting, what he's starting with, is a devastated kingdom. The Vikings have been rampaging throughout all of England for close to 100 years at this point. They've hit all the monasteries, which are the places where learning is concentrated, and they burned a lot of the books, they've killed a lot of the monks. So he's basically starting from ground zero. So like Charlemagne, the first thing Alfred does is he establishes a court school, okay? Everything is going to be centralized from my office here and will radiate out from there. But Alfred has this idea that every nobleman in Wessex will become literate. I'm going to teach every one of my noblemen how to read and write. And this is an era where very few people know how to read and write. So it's not exactly universal literacy in that he's not proposing to teach the peasants how to read and write, but the upper class. And to get things started, Alfred himself learns how to read and write Latin. So he reads these famous books in Latin, and he chooses a few of them that he translates into the Anglo-Saxon language himself. And the ones that he chooses are a book by Pope Gregory the Great. Remember the guy that led the conversion of the English, one of the great popes. Pope Gregory had written a book on how to be a good pastor, pastoral care. And so Alfred thinks that's a good one to translate. I want all my clergy to have access to this and read this. So he translates Pope Gregory the Great's pastoral care. He translates a world history, if you will, by a guy named Orosius, his histories against the pagans. So it's a world history, but through a Christian lens, right? So we're going to have a work for our churchmen. We're also going to understand our history, right? So he translates that book. And then he translates a book called On the Consolation of Philosophy, a masterpiece of the late Roman era, a work of devotion by a guy who's being persecuted for his beliefs. And Alfred thinks this is important for people to read, perhaps because the kingdom has suffered so much. And it's a way of putting in perspective the problems that they've been facing. He also commissions what is called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a history of the English, which basically year by year writes down the important things that happened in that year. And that is the source of a lot of our history for this period. It's Alfred who gets people working on that and pulling up all the documentation they can find to go back to when the Anglo-Saxons first came to Britain. On a personal level, Alfred always strives for balance in his life. And he strives in particular to divide his time evenly between his duty to God and his worldly duties. So much so that he actually invents a clock of sorts, a way to measure time so that he can be sure that he's absolutely giving half of his day to God and half of his day to his job as king. He compiles a law code, gathers together all the laws of the English that have been written up to that date, and fashions them into a code composed of 120 sections, right? Good biblical number. He writes the preface to this law code, and he draws the line of today's laws, the laws I'm writing in the year 878, all the way back to the original lawgiver himself, Moses, showing that it's one continuous concept of written law. And the thing that permeates Alfred's law code is this stress on lordship, the importance of obeying what your Lord tells you to do. That is the fundamental thread that binds Anglo-Saxon society together. As king, he constantly monitors his officials. So he is a very active king, moving throughout the kingdom, looking for reports from his guys on what they're doing and holding them accountable. So at the same time that Alfred is consolidating power and kind of re-envisioning the English part of Britain, we have an unknown number of Scandinavian settlers pouring into the Danelaw and making the population of that part of England racially mixed between the native Anglo-Saxons and these invading Scandinavians. We don't really know much about how many people came in, but we can kind of tell where they established settlements. Any town that ends with the letters BY, like Whitby, where the Synod of Whitby was held, those are Norse settlements. That's a suffix that they use for a settlement. But the problem is that these settlers are pagan. They don't yet have written records. And so the whole history of what's going on in the north of England is obscure, while we have very detailed information about what Alfred is doing in the south. All right, so Alfred has had several years to get his reforms in place, and the Vikings attacked again in the year 884, and again, Guthrum is defeated, and then 8 years later, more Vikings attack. And what we see is that the Burgle system operates exactly the way Alfred envisions it. The Vikings hit that first wave of, that first line of defense, those outer burrs, and they get bogged down. And we never see the Vikings getting into the middle of the kingdom the way that they always had in days past. So Alfred's scheme for defense in depth through the burrs proves to be exactly what the doctor ordered. So the Vikings kind of nibble around the perimeter for 4 years, hitting this burr, moving on, but they're never able to establish any kind of a severe, significant toehold in Wessex. And finally, they withdraw. And this will be the high mark of Viking Britain, because under Alfred's sons, we're going to see the reconquest of the Danelaw by Alfred's sons. Alfred dies in the year 899 AD. And to this day, he is the only English king that is called the Great. There's no other king. Elizabeth is not the Great. Henry VIII is not the Great. Churchill himself was being interviewed after successfully leading the British to victory in World War II, and the kind of sycophantic journalist who was interviewing him said, "Are you the greatest Englishman who ever lived?" And Churchill said, "No, that would be Alfred the Great." So Alfred's a biggie. We've seen why. And we're lucky that Alfred had a son and a grandson who were of the same metal as he was. And as we're going to see, a daughter who was of the same metal. So his son Edward succeeds him, and Edward reconquers everything south of the Humber River. So all of East Anglia, the rest of Mercia, basically everything but Northumbria. Okay. And before his death, he will actually be recognized as overlord by the Vikings in Northumbria, as well as the Scots and the Welsh. That's what a fearsome warrior he was, that he was recognized more or less as the toughest guy in Britain. He doesn't have direct control over those areas, but he forced them to acknowledge that he was the man, so to speak. At the same time that Edward is doing this, Alfred's daughter, a woman named Ethelfled, is also distinguishing herself. Ethelfled had married an ealdorman of Mercia, and remember, when Alfred was still alive, Mercia was only half and half, part English and part Viking. And it's going to be the first battleground in the reconquest. So when this elderman dies, his power passes not to a son, not to another guy, but in fact to Alfred's daughter, Ethelfled. And she herself leads Anglo-Saxon troops in war against the Vikings and defeats them on a couple of occasions in the cities of Derby and Leicester, to the point that she is remembered and called in her day the Lady of the Mercians. And then she leaves Mercia to her daughter to be her successor. But that daughter gets deposed by the daughter's uncle Edward, okay? The reconquest is finally completed for good in the year 954. So 55 years after Alfred's death, everything that was Anglo-Saxon before the Vikings arrived is now unified under one English kingdom. And the last Viking ruler who was overthrown in the year 954 has a great Viking name, Eric Bloodaxe. Okay? So Eric Bloodaxe is overthrown, and we finally have an English England. However, the Danelaw continues to retain its distinctive character. They're still living under Danish law and custom. So even though the English kings are the rulers there, it has its own set of laws. And the English kings mainly stay south of the Humber. They appoint eldermen to rule north of there, but they don't really go up there and visit very often. And that's important to keep in mind for the next 2 weeks when we talk about the Norman conquest. The Scandinavians are largely going to remain pagan until the 11th century, until the 1000s. And we don't know to what extent the Viking settlers in the Danelaw become Christian alongside the Christian Anglo-Saxons. But the language undergoes a transformation when you've got these two different peoples operating and living side by side, speaking languages that are kind of sort of similar to start with, okay? And they start to develop kind of a hybrid language. And so the English language undergoes its first big change here, where it kind of morphs with Old Norse. And so we get a second phase of the Anglo-Saxon language. And one of the casualties of the language at this point is the concept of gender. So if you've ever taken a foreign language like French or Spanish, right, you get this completely foreign concept of every word has a gender, you know? It's either la or la, or what is it in Spanish? El or la. A word, a noun, like a chair, is either masculine or feminine. And I don't know what it is, but that's how it works in pretty much every other European language other than English, right? We don't have the concept of gender for most of our nouns, except for ships. They're female, right? But it's in this hybridization between Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse that concept disappears, because the oldest Anglo-Saxon language did have gender, okay? So what is the relationship of Christianity to this whole Viking period? Well, what we saw was that the Vikings devastated Christian learning and leadership, but that for the English, it really was this unifying force. It was something that the English rallied around and said, this makes us different than the Vikings. We've got something worth preserving here. And as we saw with Alfred, it was an idea for trying to bridge the gap with the Vikings. If we can make them Christian, we can tame them, so to speak. And of course, the Viking legacy in Anglo-Saxon Britain, at least, is the country of England, right? It started out as 4 different warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and we ended up with one kingdom of England as a result of that. All right, so I got a bonus for you, since we're talking about the Vikings, and I call this bonus Klaus and Putin, okay? Our own friend Klaus, who's from Sweden. So what I've got here is a map showing that all the activity we've been talking about, and most of the most famous Viking activity, happened as a result of the Norwegians and the Danes, and they were all invading to the west. They were hitting Britain, they were hitting Ireland, they were hitting France. So the Norwegians and the Danes are going west, but the Swedes went east. They're hitting Eastern Europe. And they end up forming a sort of a military aristocracy over some of the East Europeans that they conquer. And they're known by the name the Rus. Okay? And if you're thinking ahead, you can probably guess where the Rus are going to end up. So that word, the Rus, possibly derives from an ancient Swedish word for sailors, okay? And like the Vikings everywhere else, the first thing they do, they sail down these rivers, they hit villages, and they force the native Slavic peoples to pay tribute to them, okay? After they've stolen from them, pay us money and we'll go away, kind of thing. But then they realized that there are a couple of settlements where they can make money on a continuing basis. They could form kind of a market center, if you will. And these 2 towns are Novgorod, which is up just south of St. Petersburg in what is now Russia, and Kyiv, okay, in Ukraine, right, which is in the news these days. And they become a ruling aristocracy over the native Slavs in Novgorod and then later Kyiv. Now, the Slavs, once their culture starts to develop, they develop this tradition that they had invited the Vikings to come and rule over them because there was so much disagreement among the Slavs themselves. Their legendary story is, we need to invite somebody from outside to rule over us, right? Which is obviously BS, okay? But it tells us that there was this tradition that they had to explain, how was it that we Slavs came to be ruled by these foreign people, these Vikings called the Rus. And that's the story they came up with. So Kyiv becomes this dominant center of this Kievan Rus culture. It has a commanding position on the Dnieper River, and the Dnieper starts all the way up in Russia and ends up in the Black Sea, and Kyiv is about halfway down, right? So there's a lot of trade that can come from the hinterlands of Russia, and it has to go through Kyiv on the way to get to the Black Sea, where you can trade with the Byzantine Empire, the Muslims, okay? And Kyiv also happens to lie on the east-west overland route that traders from Central Asia are going to use to trade with people in Europe. So Kiev is kind of at this crossroads. And the Rus are the ones who rule in Kiev. And under their founding leader, a guy named Oleg the Wise, they turned Kiev into this wonderful trading center where furs, honey, beeswax, and slaves are all brought in and then shipped off to the Black Sea. And Oleg, because of all this wealth that he's garnering through this trading emporium that he has set up, Oleg becomes the dominant power in the region, and Kiev becomes kind of the capital of this whole Slavic area. So these Rus, the Kievan Rus, are considered to be the progenitors of the Russian people. That's where Russia comes from etymologically. It goes back to the Rus, who are Swedish Vikings, who initially ruled over the Scandinavians. And as we've seen, Kiev is the original power center of this great Kievan Rus empire. That is why it's very important to Putin. Putin views Kiev as the ancestral homeland, if you will, of the Russian people. Even though it's in this country called Ukraine, in Putin's mind, it is this mystical ground zero for our nation of Russia. And that's why he's invaded Ukraine and wants to conquer Ukraine. So, I'm not going to get started with our next topic, but I will tip you off that we are going to talk about, for the next 2 weeks, the Norman conquest of England. How many people have heard of the Norman conquest? Okay. Very fundamental event in our history, English history. Big changes as a result of the Norman conquest. And we're going to go into it in great detail over the next couple weeks. And there's a lot of religious aspects to the Norman conquest that we're going to look at. So, any questions about what I covered tonight before we adjourn for the week and get ready for the Norman conquest over the next 2 weeks? How about on in Zoom land?
Yeah, they dealt with them. And they merged the Norsemen into Christianity by intermarrying.
Tim, you broke up for most of that. Can you say it one more time?
Just wondering how much of the Irish history, I've done a lot of research on that, how the Vikings invaded there and through time intermarried with a lot of the Irish kings. They were defeated. And it was the late 9th, early 9th century.
Your audio is terrible, but the gist of it is about the Irish. And yeah, indeed, the Vikings conquered Ireland as well. If you remember from my St. Patrick's class, the Irish didn't have any towns, right? It was a completely tribal, rural society. The Vikings were the ones who established the first towns in Ireland, like Dublin and Waterford. Those are Viking establishments. And they, like you said, intermarried with the Irish, and they use Ireland as a base for attacking England. We're going to talk a little bit about that during our class on the Norman conquest.
Good.
All right, well, thank you guys for your attendance tonight. And I encourage you to show up next week because Norman Conquest is good, good stuff. All right, have a great.
Thank you, Mike. Great class.
Thank you, Mike.
Yep, take care.
You as well.